This week on This is America and the World, we conclude our conversation with the renowned political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski. Dr. Brzezinski formerly served as the National Security Advisor for President Jimmy Carter and has remained a source of political advice and wisdom in Washington for decades. Currently, Dr. Brzezinski is a senior research professor of international relations at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He also serves as counselor and trustee at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. When you were part of opening up the normalization of our relationship with China, US-China, Taiwan was kind of maybe put off to the side. Is that a fair way to say it?
I think it's perfectly fair.
Fair.
And I was involved in it, and I realized that what we were doing was not pleasant for the Taiwanese. I also realized that what we were doing opened the door to a much more comprehensive relationship with mainland China, which is, 20, 40 times larger, more populated than Taiwan, probably much more times than that. 20 million, 30 million versus 2 billion. Yeah. It was necessary. And it was done in such a way that everybody knew that use of force by the residual presence there was not something that we could totally ignore. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't saying, and we're going to ignore the Taiwanese and you can now go ahead and grab it. But we didn't say it. Mm-hmm. But they knew we said it. Mm. They knew we meant it.
Is this one China policy that they stick by and say is so important? Is it so important?
And well, it is important because that to them signifies the notion that national unity is the eventual prospect. Mm. Whereas if you make it open to foreign aid and involvement or equal treatment, let's say by a country like the United States, both of the mainland and of Taiwan, you're totally rearranging the level of the relationship, mm-hmm. or the way one can search for a solution of some sort. The two countries, by and large, were developing a pattern of cooperation, mm-hmm. which is very substantive. Mm-hmm. A lot of rich Chinese go to the mainland to retire, to live, to invest, and so forth. Now all of that has been strained suddenly by a single phone call, the strategic purpose of which is not clear to me, unless we want to teach the Chinese in general some sort of a quote-unquote lesson. Mm-hmm. But what lesson and to what benefit? Mm-hmm. I think a good relationship...
This is President Trump's call with the president of Taiwan.
Yeah, I think, a good relationship with the mainland is a guarantee of a better relationship eventually with Russia, mm-hmm. because then Russia has nowhere to go. And it enhances the probability of deterring North Korea from doing something drastic. Mm-hmm. Out of the mistaken belief that we would do nothing and the Chinese would do nothing either. So I think we buy more security and more options for the exercise of constructive power by doing what I favor than by this kind of, I think, mindless experimentation or maybe just an instantaneous ad hoc decision not really thought through.
We did an interview recently with a minister from the Embassy of the People's Republic, Minister Li Kuxing. And he surprised me in the conversation by suggesting that China, the mainland, was a developing country. Do you see it as a developing country?
Well, yes, in a way. I mean, if you sort of measure development by certain objective standards of consumption, access to certain facilities, the degree of its reality across the board, obviously, they're much more a developing country than we are. We are a more developed country, mm-hmm. but we still have large sectors of our country which are underdeveloped.
Indeed.
So I think in terms of primacy, we're ahead of them, but they're closing in on us. And we have some common interests and not necessarily unavoidable geographical conflicts. So we do have a choice between working together or competing somehow or becoming even more hostile to each other.
So, friend, competitor, or enemy?
In between at first, and then perhaps if we can discover that friendship is mutually beneficial, and can be, doesn't always have to be, then it's, I think, the next step. But in any case, don't forget, if we have the Chinese with us, the Russians cannot be against us. And that is it.
Talk about that a little bit more.
Well, Russia is a major power. It has a nuclear weapons arsenal comparable to ours. It is not suicidal, and therefore it doesn't guarantee it freedom of action. And they certainly wouldn't take that risk if they thought, for example, that China next door would then take advantage of it. They have to assume, for example, I'm talking really hypothetically, that if they use nuclear weapons against us, the Russians, we retaliate against them. So we're very, very badly damaged. They are very badly damaged. And who's next door not damaged? The Chinese. And look at the Chinese territorial demands. Just look at the map and the territories that the Chinese in the past took away forcibly from the Chinese, which the Chinese increasingly want to have back. That's no victory for the Russians.
We're going to hold on that note. We're talking with Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, and we are having a lesson about the world right now. We've started our conversation about China. We'll be talking about Russia in just a moment or so. We'll talk for another 15 minutes or
15 minutes, okay.
and then we'll be going to the beach together.
Right. Exactly.
Sit tight on the other side. This is America and the World.
This is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the US-China Education Trust, and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Petroleum Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.
Doctor, I think it was the nominee for the Secretary of State, Tillerson, who made a remark about China and the South China Sea that sounded to some people like it could provoke a war if China continued to press in that direction.
Well, I assume you're referring to the Chinese militarizing some of these quasi-islands which really need extra sand to be really considered as islands. I think probably in terms of international maritime law, he's right. The question is, at what point do you choose the moment for threatening a major country regarding actions which as of themselves have no significance? China is not going to win a war or lose a war because she, so to speak, militarized these little pieces of sand. I think we have more important issues to consider with the Chinese, involving not only bilateral issues, but regional issues and long-term issues than that. So I would think that that is not perhaps the most desirable way of initiating a dialogue with the Chinese under the new president and the new Secretary of State.
If the new president is talking about a trade war, that could be very damaging to both countries, huh?
Precisely. Precisely. You've just said it. And that always then creates opportunities for others against us. So while I think he may have been technically right, because what they're doing probably is technically wrong, I didn't think this was necessarily the best issue to underline, to vocalize at a time when we're still defining the relationship and a new president is taking office who hasn't yet defined his larger vision. Now, in my view, the time is approaching that the president should really speak to the country and to the world comprehensively. But I mean seriously, not these off-the-cuff speeches which sometimes are funny, which sometimes are threatening, which sometimes can be a little vulgar. No, serious speeches, well prepared, outlining in some breadth, in some vision, what the United States is prepared to do in the world with others, for the sake of our own well-being and that of others, and what it is prepared to do to oppose those who threaten us or our friends. And I think that needs to be articulated on a significantly intellectually high level, so it stands as a major statement of purpose and vision by the #1 country in the world, and which entices other countries to feel good in being associated with us.
I'm a big believer in the fireside chat and I think Obama missed a mark in not having fireside chats to say, this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to bring you along. Could Trump do that?
You know, I think he could. There's no reason to say a priori that he can't. But I'm not so sure he can prepare a speech which says that. And this is not a criticism of it. This is not a rejection of his intellect. Not everyone can prepare an eloquent speech and read it well. But certainly with the kind of able people he has around him, and he has quite a few, not all of them, however, I think he could articulate a speech which would be compelling in its message, which would reinforce the importance of the priority of the American-Chinese connection, of the opportunities that it provides to others, and of the containing effect it has on those who are a little overly ambitious or too premature in their expectations.
Let's, as we head toward the finish line here, let's spend a few minutes talking about Russia. I suppose that most people in our country would say, very basically, what's Putin up to? What's his goal? What's his motivation?
Well, you know, it's possible that none of us know, and that includes also him. You know, one of the very peculiar aspects of Putin, especially given his communist roots, is the fact that he's one of the wealthiest people in the world, literally. Literally. He has been estimated by American and English scholars, I assume probably with specialized assistance, that he owns about $25 billion worth of estate and clothes and jewels and places for his children, and even some places being built abroad in rather fancy areas. This is a guy who is also at the same time the head of the communist movement in Russia until very recently, when he no longer exercises that special title, but certainly is part of that tradition. I'm sure that's at some point going to raise questions. You know, what kind of commitment is it? To whom? For whose good? And so forth. So he has a lot to risk. He has shown, I think, common sense in dealing with problems, but people can sometimes be driven out of balance, either by excessive ambition or restlessness or fear of being denied their assets. So I think it'll take a little time for either Putin to adjust or for a successor to emerge that will begin increasingly to realize that in significant aspects, Russia is no longer a communist state, that private individual wealth can be earned honestly and retained honestly and not secretly, and that Russia can participate in the world as one of the 3 most significant military powers in the world that have a stake in common in not fighting each other or in changing the sudden composition of the 3-way arrangement. And I think that's something we have to be alert to, and our leaders have to be alert to it. And that means also not excessive, I'm going to be very vulgar right now, but I can't think of a better expression, ass-kissing of the Russians. I think some of the people who are so enamored of the Russians in this administration, and particularly those who think that Putin is absolutely superb, don't distinguish enough between common sense and legitimacy and respect for reciprocal rights, and are wanting to endear themselves on the grounds that they have influence in the Kremlin, but in fact they're yielding effective influence to the Kremlin by their conduct.
If there were an election in which Putin had to run, would his slogan be making Russia great again?
You know, he could, because it's one of those slogans that means everything and nothing at the same time.
Is he did a land grab in the Ukraine. Would he try that someplace else?
Well, he's done a land grab, but he hasn't consolidated it. And I think he must be aware that somehow or other, if there is to be a gross accommodation between us and the Russians and others and the Europeans as well, some of the residual problems, such as the one that you have mentioned,
Ukraine,
the piece of Ukraine, have to be resolved fairly and constructively. And I think that's in Russia's interest too.
But will Putin accommodate in some way? Or
Only, I think, if he senses that the public would live with it, if it saw the benefits of it also at the same time. If the public sees him, on behalf of Russia, giving territory away, as they would perceive it if they were unyielding, then of course it won't work. But if this becomes something that increasingly involves accommodation and security and shared benefits, as I think would be the case from a leadership that was mostly at the highest level American than Chinese, but also not excluding the Russians, I think that would be appealing to a lot of Russians. Not to all of them, but perhaps enough to make more stability in that part of the world achievable.
Do I get it correctly that Putin really wants to be a powerhouse in Europe and China wants to be a powerhouse in the East? Is that fair? Is that right?
Not quite, in my judgment.
Okay.
Because he would like to be part, if he considers what I'm saying as an option, he wants to be part of a triumvirate, so to speak.
So you are bringing China, the United States, and Russia hopefully together.
If China and America collaborate with each other, only a lunatic in Russia would turn against that. Because just think where Russia would be if it turned simultaneously against China and us. And at the same time, it's very important, if that option exists, that we treat Russia with respect and treat it as a third partner. And I don't see this happening soon. And something that I've written very recently, it's probably in the press even right now, I think maybe in 20 years from now, or within 20 years.
What will happen?
This kind of a larger three-way arrangement, which preserves the fundamentals of peace, as we try to deal simultaneously with the problem of socio-economic change in our own societies, but also the climate change, which is going to be very important and very complicating.
But is it not so important as well to keep China and Russia a little apart? They could get too close and then gang up on us.
Yeah, but they have that. They have some legacies of past problems that prevents them from becoming a totally self-embracing friends. But is it important for us to have a wedge in there? We don't have that. We don't have to have that. That reality exists. The fact of the matter is that a very large slice, important slice of Chinese territory was seized by force and annexed by the Russians in 1850. And what is interesting, and it's rather revealing in my judgment, that after years of ignoring that, the Chinese are beginning to mention that. And if you look at the map, and if you want to see the piece of Siberia, eastern piece of Siberia, which comes closest to touching Alaska, that's a large, large piece of territory. It's empty, it's that territory, and more Chinese would like to be in it.
Just have a few minutes left. Let me just throw out a couple of last topics for us to tackle, and thank you very much. Israel-Palestine. What's your hope?
My hope is the same it has been for years, namely peaceful, genuine, neighborly coexistence in which both sides are treated with respect by the other. And not one is subordinated to the other. And I think public opinion polls show that most Israelis agree with that. Perhaps not most Palestinians would agree with it, actually, even though they're much the weaker party. But I think they would be drawn by it. And
why wouldn't they be supporting it?
Out of nationalistic resentments about the past and lack of confidence that promises like these would be delivered. But if an effort was made in that direction, I think Israel, together with Palestine, would become the equivalent of Singapore. Become the equivalent of Singapore in the Middle East to what Singapore was in the Southwest Asia.
What happens if, as President Trump and his team have suggested, the capital is moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
Look,
Does all hell break loose?
it could. It depends on how it's done. Suppose there were two capitals in Jerusalem. I mean, it's a fairly large piece of land, so there's no doubt why religious Israelis, if they want to have the capital in Jerusalem, could not swallow hard. Of course, it wouldn't be easy, but swallow hard and let the Palestinians also have a capital somewhere in non-Judaic part of Jerusalem. And of course, Jerusalem largely is more non-Judaic than Judaic. But that would help to resolve problems. Problems like these can be resolved with patience. Imposition of one outcome over another outcome tends to prolong the crisis.
How about ISIS? How big a threat? How can it be taken out? Or are there always going to be these terrorism acts?
Well, it will fade over time, especially as some of the Arabic or Muslim entities are established with confidence and more self-respect and can govern themselves and not be simply vaguely, thinly camouflaged colonies of the West or of Western powerful countries. And these are people who haven't found themselves yet. Some countries are already important, successful, Turkeys, for example. But there are others that are yet far from being an established, self-respecting countries, and therefore this kind of extremist violence attracts some individuals.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this question. What is the role of the National Security Advisor and his team or her team, and how important is that in setting our foreign policy?
You know, that depends on the president, first of all, himself, the extent to which he wants to have a team that works for him, and the extent to which he wants a national security advisor that is close to him, or a president who keeps the distance a little further away and who operates more in secrecy and doesn't permit any single individual to play the key role in that process. Different presidents at different stages made one choice or the other.
In all of the things that you've been involved in over the years, what one thing sticks out as a great accomplishment or great satisfaction for you?
Well, I first of all have to sort of elaborate a little bit. I worked very closely with the president. I would see him scores of times a day, directly and immediately, no problem of access. The direct telephone communication also, not through others. He was my boss. I liked him very much. He was the decision maker. I respected that. We got along very well personally at the same time, and I had a sense of confidence because of that. Once he sent his secretary into my office, who walked in, strutted very self-importantly, and held a green envelope, presidential envelope, with a note for me. And I said to myself, my God, what is this? So I open it, and the note says inside, Zbig, don't you ever know when to stop? Signed, Jimmy. And I thought that was the highest declaration of confidence in me I could possibly imagine. And I went in immediately into his office and thanked him. And he was laughing. And at the same time, he meant it. And I respected him as my leader. And I thought he was terrific. I think he was one of the much underestimated presidents of the United States.
Oh, I liked him very much.
And I was very privileged to have that kind of relationship with him in which I could be myself, but knowing very well that I was working for him. And he was the boss. But we got along very well. In that sense, everything I did, and I asked my staff to do, everyone else in the government knew that if they want to have a fight with me, they better think twice.
Because they were facing two for the price of one.
Perhaps.
If there were a sign that you wanted to place over the door of the Oval Office for President Trump to kind of glance up at as he walked in on a daily basis, what would the sign say?
Well, and that's very difficult to say because I can't really put something in his head or mouth that doesn't fit my experience or my affection, for example, for the president for which I worked. But if I wanted to be mysterious, I forget what number Obama was. What was it?
44?
44?
And this is 45?
Maybe in Roman numerals I would put 44 on his door.
Doctor, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
For information about This Is America and the World, and to watch all of our programs, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, and look for us on Facebook and Twitter. You can now listen to all of our ambassador interviews on our new podcast, the Ambassador Series. It's available on our website and iTunes. This is America and the World is brought to you by the National Education Association, the US-China Education Trust and F.Y. Chang Foundation, guided by Ambassador Julia Chang Block, President. The League of Arab States, representing 350 million people in 22 member countries. The Petrolin Group, expertise with integrity in the fields of oil and gas, exploration and production, energy, and infrastructure. The Rotendaro Family Trust. The Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. And Ventana Productions, television facilities, editing, and distribution services.